In a sneaky attempt to mislead you and sway public opinion, I've seen all sorts of ads and posts lately from the logging industry littered with all sorts of misinformation about old-growth forests, and I wanted to take a moment to address a big glaring fallacy that they all claim here, that here in BC, we have 11.1 million hectares of old-growth forest remaining in the province, so we shouldn't be concerned with, running out of old growth, and we shouldn't be pursuing the imminent changes and reform that we're seeing in the industry. Now, as a general statement, having 11.1 million hectares of old growth remaining isn't necessarily a lie, but instead just a gross oversimplification of the reality that we live in. So to start, the province of BC is just under 94.5 million hectares in size, and about 60 million hectares of that is considered forest land. So almost 2/3 of the province is considered forest. Not bad, right? So of those 60 million hectares, most of that is second or third growth forest that has already been logged, and only 11.1 million are considered to be old growth forests based on the government's own newly updated calculations, or about 18% of all the forests in BC. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that this definition of old growth from the government is age-based, defined as trees over 250 years old out here on the coast and 140 years old in the interior of the province. So it isn't limited to exclusive primary forest that hasn't ever been logged, and as a result, it may include areas that were once logged but have since regrown in that time. There are also a couple of other definitions of old growth that are really important to understand here, previously summarized as either high productivity or low productivity types of old growth forests. Now, low productivity old growth forests are areas where there are really old trees, but they're often stunted in growth, short and scraggly from the environments they live in, like high alpine areas or bogs, which coincidentally are tricky spots to log in the first place. High productivity old growth forests, on the other hand, are areas where trees grow to be very old very easily, often these rich, luscious stands of towering Douglas firs or giant western red cedars that can be 1,500 years old individually and existing in an ecosystem that has evolved over multiple generations of 1,000-year-old trees to be truly unique and irreplaceable on a 70-year crop rotation. It's these forests that are in high demand to be logged for their quality timbers and are also the ones plastered all over Destination BC's billboards and the greenwash ad campaigns from these very same industry organizations. Now, both types are technically old-growth forests by the age definition used by the government, despite these ecosystems being radically different from one another. In the latest round of data and announcements from the BC NDP, these terms have been shifted slightly to areas that are considered to be ecologically at risk of irreversible loss, meaning that they're at risk from being logged and changed from a primary forest into a second-growth forest. Again, many low-productivity old-growth forest sites are not only difficult to log in the first place, but there's no real demand for that scraggly timber, so these areas aren't considered to be at risk, whereas the big, high-productivity old-growth forests with valuable timber that are still actively being logged today are considered to be at risk. Make sense? Okay, moving forward. So of those remaining 11.1 million hectares of old-growth forests, only 3.5 million hectares are currently protected, leaving 7.6 million hectares unprotected. 2.6 million hectares of that is considered to be not at-risk forest, i.e. stunted, low-productivity forest that no one wants to log anyways, with the remaining 5 considered to be ecologically at risk of irreversible loss due to logging. Those remaining 5 million hectares represent 8% of the forests we have here in BC, or 5.2% of all the landmass in BC, and are the last unprotected pieces of primary forest that we will ever have, ever. Because once they're logged and transformed into second growth forests, those ecosystems will never be the same again, even if the replanted crop is allowed to age to the government's age-based definitions. Now, last fall, the BC NDP did announce plans to defer 2.6 million hectares of those remaining 5, though they are continuing to log the rest, yet progress in these deferrals has been hindered by a lack of support for the Indigenous nations on whose land these forests stand, as well as a ton of industry pushback in the form of misleading ads and greenwash statements in an effort to muddy the waters and confuse the public, because the more confused you are, the more complacent you're going to be, which allows them to maintain this broken model for just a few more years, which is just incredibly short-sighted and selfish, especially when considering that a vast majority of all that has already been logged, a whopping 82% of all of our forests, I would say that about 98% of that has been done by these same companies that came to be from patriarchal colonial forces against the will of and without consent from the Indigenous nations on whose land those forests all once stood. It's obvious that when we break down the numbers of the actual type, size, and quality of old growth remaining in the province, that the numbers are frighteningly low, with those proposed 2.6 million hectares of deferrals only equating to 4.6% of all the forests we have in the province. What's more is that if we bounce back to that high productivity old growth definition we talked about earlier, of the absolute cream of the crop in productivity, richness, and diversity, there's only about 400,000 hectares remaining, or 0.8% of all the forests in BC, and much of it is still outside these deferral areas and being logged as you sit here listening to this. It's horrible, sad, and scary, yes, but it's the reality of the world we live in today. So the next time you see a post or an ad or some blatant industry misinformation that tries to convince you that we have an abundant 11.1 million hectares of old growth in the province, or that we'll never run out, or that we're doing it sustainably despite ending up in this apocalyptic mess of scarcity, feel free to enlighten them with the real numbers. Because acknowledging the reality of the situation we're all in is the only way that we're all going to be able to work together to build a future that benefits all of us here in the real world.